Welcome, Bill. We are very glad to have today with us Bill Fisher, professor, but also I think one of the real experts on the journey that IR went through in the last 4 years, trying to rethink and revamp what management and leadership mean into an IoT, into a turbulent, into an interconnected market. Today with Bill, we're going to have a conversation to explore the long-term trends and impacts, but also the deep principles that are inspiring some of the practices that we are seeing in IR, but that we are also seeing in other organizations. So first of all, Bill, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, Emanuele, thank you for inviting me. It's always fun to talk about hire. It's always fun to be with you guys at Boundaryless. And I must say that the only thing that troubles me is that when you say I'm an expert, you know, I realize that if I'm an expert, we're all in trouble. But I'll do my best. I think I'm a observer of a remarkable journey, and that's about as far as I'm going to go.
I think you are very humble, but still, maybe you're raising a point at the end. The meaning of having expertise is also changing, and this could be part of our conversation today.
Right.
So my first question is a bit broader of IR itself. I think in the last few decades, each one of us has seen a number of technological and social disruption that brought a massive power shift between the inside of the firm and the outside of the firm. At the same time, a bit on the background, but not much on the background, especially in some countries, such as the USA. We have a growing level of risk, uncertainty, and unpredictability due to global environmental crises, political instabilities. And all of this is reflected on organizations that are becoming exposed to lack of productivity, inability to keep up with the market, absenteeism, and I must say also a need to reinvent themselves very deeply, both at the cultural level and at the business model level. How do you see these big long-term trends playing out in your own work, in your own research, in your own consulting activities?
So it's profound. I mean, you know, every generation thinks that they're special and they're in a, you know, but I think we have a claim to at least historically be among the generations that are that are experiencing enormous change in several different dimensions at the same time. You know, you think about digital transformation, which is really changing the way most organizations work, and then you add on top of that hyperconnectivity, which is an outcome of that, and you think about the way in which customer experience expectations are growing rapidly, exponentially, and then you throw in, you know, things like the COVID virus, the impending climate catastrophe that we all know we're facing, but nobody's doing anything about. And you think about frustration with the way in which human talent is being employed. And you know, all of those things open up requirements to do something and do something fast, and the ability to do something and do something really wonderful. And so I think that's never going to change in our lifetime. I mean, why would it get simpler? You know, this moment when you and I are speaking is the easiest, simplest, slowest moment in the rest of our lives. From here on out, it gets only more complex and more rapid. And so I think it's going to change the way we think about managerial choices and organizational design, all that sort of stuff. I think it's big.
And I think what you are saying gives even more importance to our conversation, because that means that things are going just to get worse if we don't start to address them. So we have, I guess, a big responsibility and a big opportunity at the same time to say try to fill the dots and to build some connections. And this is really one of my goals for today. And the starting point for this conversation, as you know, is the amazing work that the Hires has been doing for 4 years. I think there is no need for me to explain to you, because probably you know much more than myself about it. But it is my understanding that what John Grimin did is partially a response to these long-term far-fetching trends. So my second question for you is, what does really stand out for you in terms of both the direction, but also, let's say, the artifacts, the practices, and the experiments that the Hire has been trying the last 4 years as a response to these macro, global, and quite worrying trends?
So that's a good question, because I think what makes Hire different is there's 3 or 4 things that make it really different. One is one is the persistence. So it's been doing this for 4 decades. Well, you know, not the magnitude of changes that it's doing now, but you can see the fingerprints, the DNA, if you will, of today's changes as far back as 1984 or so. You know, they're there, and so that continuity of change is remarkable. I don't know of any other. There are very few organizations that have been that persistent in the tree, and the scale. The scale is 70, 80,000 people. You know, it's big. So this is not a small startup, you know, with kids running around in flip-flops. This is real people making real things. I think that makes it different. I think the other thing that makes it different is that it's in what traditionally has been called an old economy industry. So this is not the high-tech stars that we associate with all sorts of innovative work. This is a real company in an industry that for a long time was making commodity products. So those things make it really different. In fact, for a business school, this is a wonderful example, because you bring it, most executives who go to business schools come from, you know, successful market leading incumbents that are doing things in traditional ways and highly bureaucratic. And they envy the, you know, Apples and Googles and Alibabas of the world, Tencents, because they say they can do these things we can't, but Hire's doing them. So, you know, so in a sense, it becomes a beacon of hope for all managers. You know, if they can do it, we can do it. And I think that that's a major differentiator of Hire. I think that's why it's so inspiring. The other thing, if I can just make a short answer long, is that what I see is most organizations, everybody today aspires to be transformational, but that's usually where the conversation stops, with the aspirations. I think the thing that also differentiates Hire in my mind is the details. So not only do they have daring, bold aspirations, but they then build a system that mechanically supports what they want to do. So it makes it easier to do these things rather than harder. And that's wonderful, I think.
You touched upon a couple of very interesting points. The first one, I think it's a bit frustrating for large incumbents, because, you know, working with many of them, so you're thinking, yeah, but, you know, we are big, you know, we have lots of people, we are global, we are not doing knowledge, we are doing real stuff. And Hire is removing all those excuses, because it's a demonstration that this is possible. And maybe it's a bit surprising for some of these organizations that haven't been exposed to it. Yeah, it's a demonstration, it's possible, but it is also the visualization of the distance, maybe between your own organizational culture and structures and what the most extreme part of the market is doing. the second aspect that you have highlighted is the mechanics. There is lots of talking, lots of lip service in my experience, but maybe not enough action, or not an action that is not brave enough. So which are the practices in this case that really are meaningful for you as a demonstration of the trajectory that Hire is doing? So what's really surprising about it?
Well, you know, I think one of the things that, so let me just step away for a second from the mechanics, and let me just talk about some other things that are I think unique with Hire, or relatively unique. One is that they have, so this is not their first transformation. They, you know, depending on how you count, there's been 3, 4, 5, not 4, 5, 6 transformations. Each one of them has come before it's necessary. So rather than waiting until the industry of which they're a part runs into the threat of disruption, Hire has disrupted itself. It's disrupted its industry, and itself in the process. And so I think that's the perfect time to do this. You make your move when resources are abundant and people feel good, right? Most organizations that I work with never make the move, and when they start thinking about it, resources are scarce and people are afraid. So that's not the time to do that, right? So I think one of the things that's been interesting about Hire is its timing. I think the other thing is that these are big changes, but they're big changes built on incremental choices, right? So there, and a lot of familiarity. So, you know, I would argue that the performance management system that Hire uses today is a direct lineal descendant of what they used in the early 80s. And if you brought a manager from the early 80s back to see what they were doing today, she or he would understand that performance management system. So I think what Hire is not doing, Hire is not asking people to take a flying leap into the unknown, right? Hire is providing, if you will, handrails that are familiar. And so you're not overtaxing the sensory capacity of individuals. They don't have to be afraid of everything. They just have to focus on 1 or 2 things because everything else is relatively familiar. And I think that's a very clever way to move into the future. And then of course, you know, they're bold. They're really bolder than anybody else, but they're bolder because the rest of the changes are sort of inconsequential. So it's the big ones that they have to worry about, not the small ones. You know, I just moved back to the US this week from Switzerland, and it's that we thought that was a big move, but it's the small, after living in Switzerland for 25 years, it's the small things that are just slowing us down. It's all the detailed stuff. And I think Hire addresses that. At the same time, they're encouraging people to make the big jump. So it makes it easier for them to change.
Are you implying that it takes 40 years to get this far?
No, but I am implying that 40 years is an enormous advantage, because over 40 years, Hire has developed an employment brand of being an organizational innovator, an organization that prizes entrepreneurship. So the people that it hires today are perfect for the challenges Hire is going to throw at them. And they're perfect for that because they know that Hire has this employer brand that is consistent. Most organizations pay very little attention to that. And so they get a group of people that they hire, some of whom are enthusiastic about change, others who hate it. And they start off with problems, you know, on the home front before they even start to conquer the future. So I think 40 years has really played to Hire's advantage.
And does this help with self-selecting people? So what I hear in the statement is maybe this is not for everybody. Is this what you are thinking? So at the end, to thrive in an environment like Hire's one, you have to believe in something, you have to be able to live something that is dramatically different from what we experience in many other organizations. Is it true?
I think it's really helpful, and I think it is true, and I'm struck by, so over the last couple of years, I've interviewed a number of micro enterprise, and we'll talk about micro enterprises in a minute, micro enterprise leaders, and and every one of them has a different entry story. So no two of them seem to be alike. No, that they all have come from different places for different reasons and done different things. But what they do have in common is they see hire as a place where they can live out their entrepreneurial dreams. And that's really rare for a large company to have that sort of image.
I agree. It's probably unique, or at least quite rare. Let's jump into the mechanics for a bit, if you agree. So we have micro enterprises that are already a bit surprising for many incumbents. We have EMCs, this new concept for empowering micro enterprise to coordinate themselves, not to impose a coordination. And then we have a number of other tools, let's say like industry platforms, SSPs, shared services platforms.
Right.
And then we have smart contracts, we have blockchain. What's really surprising if you put yourself into the shoes of, you know, a big telco or a big oil and gas company or a big manufacturing company, because at the end, Ayer is producing services, but it's still producing goods.
Right.
Which one of these, or maybe all of these, are so dramatically different from what you would expect in a traditional organization?
So we could argue about this forever, right? Because everybody has a different opinion. You know, for me, the micro enterprises really capture for me the essential elements of what the higher spirit, or what's called Rendon Hui. If you think about Rendon Hui as a philosophy, there are three elements that are important. One is hire wants to give the customer a great experience. Second is it wants to employ the talent and expertise it hires to do that. It wants to free up that talent so that they can fulfill their potential in the service of customer expectations. And the third thing is it shares the value created with the customer and with the employees who create it. So the micro enterprise, and this is the latest stage in a 40-year journey that started with giving people responsibility, measuring those responsibility on a daily basis, rewarding them. So I mean, you can see this. It's changed. It's gotten bigger. It's richer. It's more complex and more interesting. But you know, it's an evolution. And I think that what Hire has done is it has really taken the micro enterprise concept to what I think is its ultimate expression. So, you know, you have the three rights: the right to create strategy for your micro enterprise, the right to hire and fire, and the right to distribute. So the right to make big choices, the right to hire and fire, and the right to distribute the value created. And out of that comes zero distance to the customer, because it makes sense if you're in a micro enterprise to get as close to the customer as you can get. It out of that also comes, and that means you're faster moving and faster reacting and much more customer intimate. It gives you a stake in the game, because I'm not only playing for the corporate shareholders, now I'm playing for myself. It allows me to be an owner as well as an entrepreneur. I mean, there's so much going on in those concepts that I think the micro enterprise for me is, the most interesting piece of it. But I have friends who will tell you it's the platforms or it's the EMCs, and I just this morning I've spoken to people on both sides of that spectrum. And what's interesting is that they all fit together to make this synergy, which gives you more rather than less.
Thank you. Very, very insightful. And I agree. I think that that the micro enterprise is at the end maybe the smaller, but not definitely the less important aspect of this journey.
But Emanuele, let me ask you a question here, or let me speculate something. As we move into an ever more complex future where the customer expects more and Hire needs to respond quickly, Hire has chosen to partner with external partners in order to be able to bring in expertise and talent that it couldn't get otherwise. And so there begins to be a blurring between the Hire boundaries and the boundaries of these partners. And I think at some point, the platforms on which the micro enterprises sit will become extremely important because they are the best opportunity for scalable learning that I've seen going into an unknown future. So I think there's a real, so this is dynamic equilibrium, right? It's changing all the time.
Yeah, you're raising so many good points. I need to mentally remember them because I want to come back to a few of them. What you are just saying is that to me is that this idea that the Hire is building at the end is not just rethinking the firm. It might eventually reach an inflection point in which there is no firm, or the firm somehow blurs into a market in which you have many micro enterprises that belong to more than one firm. Is it something that you envision eventually, if this evolution, as you said, at the end is going to play out not just at the company level, but at the market, at the global level? Is this something even possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I think absolutely. I remember a conversation I had with a ecosystem owner within Hire. So a micro enterprise leader who also was responsible for an ecosystem, who said that already today, our most important competitive assets are our relationships. Now, that's an interesting thought because the relationships are almost all outside. So if that's your most important asset, what does that mean for the structure of the firm? What does that mean for the way strategy is determined? What does that mean for intellectual property and branding? I mean, those are, everything changes when you adopt that sort of, the relationships are more important than anything else.
And this brings me back to another point you raised. You said philosophy.
Yes.
And I must say that in the West, we tend to copy the practices, but somehow to ignore or misunderstand or not to implement the philosophy, the principles behind it.
Right.
And I'm starting to see on the market a number of big firms talking to clients and suggesting them to copy paste the random EE. Look, there is this new model. Why not trying it as we did with Agile from Spotify and ING and others? So my next question for you is looking at the philosophy. And I know that Zheng Ruimin really is into it and their roots are into it. What's the deep philosophical perspectives that maybe are different to copy for us in the West that are the real enablers and also the beacon for the evolution of the practices in the random EE?
So I have to say that I haven't seen any choices that hires made that could not be made by anybody else, right? I mean, there's no magic. There's no secret ingredients. What hire is doing, anybody could do, but they choose not to. And I think and for me, the most important one is the willingness to give up control at different levels in the management system, including the very top, because the old control mechanism makes no sense any longer. And I think that's difficult because managers spend their lives trying to amass control, you know, as they move up the hierarchy. But if you really believe in zero distance with the customer, and you really believe that people who are close to the customer know the customer better, and therefore, why would they ever need permission from somebody else to be able to do what's obvious to them? Then you really do give up control. You know, Kevin Nolan, who's the CEO of General Electric Appliances in the United States, says that they've done away with their corporate strategy group because they're a higher company. They've done away with their corporate strategy group because the strategic decisions are being made at the micro enterprise level or the platform level, you know, and so strategy, corporate strategy, if you will, to the extent that it exists, is really the ex post rationalization of a lot of different choices being made by a lot of different people. That's very different than GE would have experienced, you know, 20 years ago, when it would be all have been made at the top. So for me, that's probably the most difficult thing that I see happening for other organizations to emulate. So you see, as a result, you see organizations who try. I spoke to somebody just the other day who have micro enterprises, but they don't give them autonomy. So, you know, so to be fair, those micro enterprises perform better than the old silos do, because the old silos really didn't engender pride in what people were doing, or a feeling of, you know, this is mine, I want it to work. But think about how far they could go if they really allowed the workers to take control of their destiny in those small micro enterprises. And can I make one more? I'm sorry.
No, sure, please. Go ahead.
One of the things that I think is so important to recognize is that hire has not lost its mind when it does this. What it has is a series of checks and balances throughout the organization, so that any micro enterprise that makes really bad decisions will be corrected fairly quickly, either from within inside the micro enterprise or on the platform. So it's not as if it's not as if they've abdicated responsibility. They're just expressing it differently.
Can you tell us a bit more about this? Because I believe that some organizations listening to us may be asking themselves the very same question. So at the end, how may I release control, but at the same time also maintain some safeguards, some, you know, protection systems that may avoid the boat to sink?
Sure. So if you're in the in the kitchen appliance business, for example, you are moving from a world where you perhaps spoke to the customer once every 10 or 15 years. They would come in, they'd buy a refrigerator. You were good at that, you know, 30-minute pitch. They left. If the refrigerator works, they come back again 10 years later, 15 years later, buy another one. Today, nobody buys just a refrigerator. Well, probably almost half of Hire's customers today no longer buy just a standing unit. They buy a suite of hyper-connected appliances that talk to one another. And those people have a different perception of what those appliances do for them and how they work. So the typical customer buying a new connected kitchen, a smart kitchen, can talk to hire 10 or 15 times a day, not once every 10 or 15 years, but 10 or 15 times a day. Now that's a completely different competitive environment to be in. So what I think happens is, I think what Hire has seen is that you simply don't want to scale up what you're already doing in a normal kitchen. You want to really speak to the conversations that the customers are generating. You now know what they're buying. You now know how they're using your appliances. You can help them with recipes. You can help them with food pairings. You can help them with wine selections, all sorts of stuff. But you can only do that if you think ahead of the curve, right? Because nobody else is doing that. We've never done this before. We have no idea what's going to work and what isn't going to work. So one of the mechanics that Hire has chosen, and I emphasize the word chosen because it's a conscious managerial choice, is Hire has decided that this is my interpretation, Hire has decided that it's better to bet on the future by allowing employees who really know what's going on in an industry to take some chances rather than predict, roll the dice for one big roll, rather than predict what's going to happen and hope you get it right. And so what Hire has said is, to start a micro enterprise, you need 3 employees, and they need to convince a platform that they have a good idea. So that's a license to innovate. But what Hire has also said is, and oh, by the way, those 3 employees are responsible for bringing in the seed capital to start this thing. So, what we're saying is, take a bet, and if your bet works, and we respect you for your expertise in the industry. That's why we're allowing you to do this. And if your bet works, you have a chance to become a startup star. I mean, to be financially wealthy and well-respected everywhere. If it doesn't work, you're going to lose some of the money that you brought in, your own money or outside capital. The company is not at risk like it might be if it was placing the resources on the table. And we'll end this thing fairly quickly, and you'll go back into the labor pool and hire. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to build the possibility, I think, of taking some really interesting big choices without incurring associated risks that could imperil the health of the organization.
Yeah, at the end, what Hire seems to be doing is massively parallelizing experiments with skin in the game from the people, but also with the support of a big corporation at the end to making them work, making them succeed, making them scale. It looks like a significant difference, discontinuity from how we think about strategy, how we think about innovation, how we think about operations, basically everything.
Right, and remember, the owner, those employees, and we're talking about micro enterprises sizes maybe 10 or plus and minus. Those employees will always own the majority of the equity. So if this thing takes off, they specifically are going to be rewarded financially for this. Hire might exercise its options to have a minority share, but the majority share is always going to be with the. So that's a very interesting inducement to me. It also treats expertise, tacit expertise in particular, stuff you pick up on the job, treats it seriously, respects it, and offers it the opportunity to see what it can do. And when we talked earlier about frustration with the fulfillment of talent, this seems to me to be a real counterweight to that. This is saying, we respect what you know. We're going to give you, if you want, we'll give you a chance to try something and see how it works.
Let's do another step in the topics we want to cover today. Our feeling as Boundaryless is that Hire is a very mature example of an undergoing trend, actually an undergoing set of trends. And many people into this space are aware about other examples, such as Burzorg, such as Morningstar, such as W.L. Gore, such as Whole Foods Market, and others,
Right.
but with different names in different parts of the world, in different industries. I've been running other experiments. Do you see any connection? Do you see any common theme, any common principle between these pioneers of self-management and self-organization and what Ayer is doing with Random He?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I'm going to try to resist talking about the structures, because the structures, I think the structures are different, right? And the structures are interesting, and the structures are, when we look at those organizations that you've mentioned, the structures are so different that that becomes a categorizer of these organizations. But you know, before we get, those structures are byproducts of other choices. And we started out this conversation talking about the meta themes that are running through our environment. And I think I think that the leadership of the organizations you mentioned have similar observations about the world around us, whether it's about we need to get more out of our talent for the talent's sake, or customer expectations need to be bolder, or the technology is changing the environment, we need to be faster. I hear those things over and over and over again when I talk to the firms that you're mentioning. So I think then what happens is the almost inevitable dismemberment of the organization and breaking it into smaller units, whether they're micro enterprises or I think that's, or branch offices in Handelsbanken. I think that's almost inevitable, right? I think that what you see is that if we're going to do this, we've got to get people more involved, and we can't get them more involved at the scale that most of these organizations are. So we need to attack the scale, and we need to attack the incentives, and we need to attack the proximity, the closeness to the customer. And I think as you do that, it becomes ineluctable, almost unavoidable, that you get smaller organizations, end-to-end involvement, local P&Ls, small P&Ls, in order to be able to make this work. So the mechanics are really important, but they're driven by the pursuit of these meta objectives that are, and I think in almost every case, the firms involved think it's a bet your business type of situation, that we're moving into an operating situation where the present business is unfit for service. And we've got to do something radical to change it. Not because we want to do something radical, but because that's the only way we're going to get the engagement that we want and the closeness to the customer that we want.
So flipping the coin, if the market is asking us to do this, and we have now plenty of examples, and we have Ayer demonstrating that this is doable at scale, it is doable everywhere, it is doable in every industry.
Right.
Why are still most traditional organizations stuck in an anachronistic, let's say, unproductive mindset, approach, principles, culture, whatever we want to give the responsibility to? What is missing, and why this journey is so difficult, and why it cannot be, I believe it cannot be copied just by visiting Ayer?
So the wise guy answer, the wise guy response is because they choose to be, right? And I think that's true. I think these organizations, either explicitly or implicitly, probably implicitly, shy away from the choices that Ayer makes. I think part of it is that they don't trust their employees sufficiently to do the right thing, or to be leaders. Actually, what's interesting is yesterday I spoke to an organization that has micro enterprises and not Ayer, and they said, we're experimenting this, we're in the early days. Strangely enough, the the best employees are ones who were not the best employees in the old bureaucratic model, right? That our real stars are people who are outliers in the traditional model. So I think, you know, organizational functions and measurement systems tend to categorize people by performance along traditional dimensions. And what we're talking about is changes that defy those traditional dimensions. So in a sense, we're not only asking leaders to give up control, but we're asking them to give up control to the very people that they suspect are, you know, on the margins of the organization. These people are probably highly talented. They're on the margins of the organization because the organization doesn't speak to their needs or talent or desires. And yet nobody sees that or nobody talks about that. So my sense is the biggest single problem is not awareness, but hesitancy to take the first step. If you know, if I have a year or two to go in my position and I take the first step now, I don't have another position coming and it doesn't work, right? So I think it's a sense of trying to preserve the status quo, not because we know it works, but because we can't imagine what would happen if we turned it upside down.
But then what's the starting point? So, okay, if this is the reality we must, or we are at least living with,
right.
What's maybe the starting point with the expectation of getting it before 40 years? Because
So
not every organization has 40 years.
Right. I think there's two schools of thought. One school of thought says, look around, find the place that you can change easiest, begin the change. Often it's not a particular function or process, but it's the future. So we're going to run future-oriented projects different than we run the present. We're going to have, every organization has to manage its future and its present. The present always wins unless the future is protected. So we're going to protect the future. We're going to move it somewhere else. We're going to change the name, and we're going to give them the license to run that organization differently. But that means the people who are presently working in the present have no future, right? So maybe that's not such a good idea. The alternative, which I've heard Gary Hamel and Mr. John Ray Min say, is that, you know, you have to have the courage to change it all right now, you know, and if it works, if you believe it's going to work in the future, why not have it work now in the present? And I have to say that my sympathies are with the latter. My sympathies are with that. But when I talk to managers, they all are very much into, let's change the future and use that as a laboratory for experimentation. But of course it's not big and it's small and it's, you know, and then let's run the present the way it's always run. And I think we're going to see over the next few years real efforts to transform large successful organizations doing both things, both approaches.
And this is another area you touched upon before, and then you're bringing up again, the CEO, the leader.
Yes.
I think quite all of the stories I mentioned, and of course, Ayer is another one, have a very charismatic, you know, leader.
Right.
A crazy philosopher, you know, somebody that is not really fitting with the mainstream and that is brave enough to do something different and risky, and
yes.
sometimes to bet the boat with it. Is this mandatory? Is this really the key and potentially part of the problem in those organizations that are not trying?
So ironically, I think that organizations that aspire to be bottom up almost always have to have strong, self-confident, courageous top-down leaders, right? Because they're the only ones who are willing to share responsibility and give up control. And I don't think this is a new thing. I think if you look back historically, if you look at ABB with Percy Barnevik, or if you look at, I was very interested in an organization in Denmark called Oticon. They make hearing aids. I'm wearing Oticons right now out of loyalty to them. My first case was an Oticon case. But they had a fellow named Lars Koland in the early 90s who turned the organization upside down, very similar in many ways to what John Raymond is doing with Hire. Or you look at Burzog, I can never pronounce it, or you look at Handelsbanken. You know, what's interesting about all of them, I would say, is that the leaders themselves are not charismatic per se. They are serious and thoughtful and well-informed. And all of them, their charisma then is vested in what they know and how seriously they take it and their commitment, rather than some type of flashy, superficial type of charisma. And they're very effective in moving the organization. I mean, there's a small design firm in Palo Alto called IDEO. It's very well known for, it was one of the founders of design thinking. Their founder, Dave Kelly, he said, he defined the job of the CEO as giving and protecting the self-confidence of people who had to make big decisions, right, down below in the organization. Kevin Nolan, who's the CEO of General Electric Appliances, says that his primary job as CEO is to make things smaller. You know, John Ray Min has demonstrated this over and over and over again by giving people responsibility, letting them run. So my sense is that it's a different type of leadership. It's a leadership that's constantly curious, that's very much aware of what's going on, that's outside in. All of this is outside in, that understands what's going on around the organization, and then tries to shape the organization so that it's responsive to what's going on outside. And the curiosity part is really important, because they search out other people doing these things and invite them in to learn from. So I think there's a lot of things in common among people who have launched these transformations.
Isn't there also risk in it? Take the example of Oticon and Hayes and many others that have been pioneers, but at some point, due to a number of reasons, ownership shifting, market shifting, eventually went back to traditional hierarchical structures. And CEO Jean Grimin has been guiding, or if we don't,
Yes.
we don't want to say guiding, at least inspiring, energizing this journey for years. What is going to happen when eventually it will have to leave the baby, the big baby, go?
Right.
How's this transition looking like? So is there a risk in this, and how to protect the organization from it?
So there's always a risk, right? It's business, and there's always a risk involved. And you know, if and you're right about Oticon and ABB had big reversals in what they were tempted to do, largely because of unforeseen surprises, surprises in demand, surprises in the marketplace, surprises in what they understood the business to be like in ABB's case, and what after a big acquisition, and how that really played out. And you think about the present COVID-19 crisis and how that has affected many businesses who have taken some chances, and all of a sudden, you know, they're scrambling to survive. And I think that's an unavoidable part of taking chances. What John Raymond has said to me is that when people ask him about who will be the leaders after he retires, he says we already have them. We have, you know, several thousand micro enterprise leaders, and they're running businesses. Now, they're not as big as Hire, but they're running them in the same spirit of how Hire is run. And they are gaining self-confidence as they go along. So he said, we're in a sense, we're generating, not only generating new businesses and interesting extra value for the customers and the like, but we're generating a new leadership cadre. I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that. You know, about 15 years ago, boy, it seems so long ago, 15 years ago, I wrote a book with a colleague, Andy Boynton, a book called Virtuoso Teams. And what we looked at was small teams that changed the industries that they were a part of. And they changed the industries they were a part of. And incidentally, this was without reference to hire. It was a completely different sort of situation. But what we found was small teams that where everybody was involved, end-to-end types of engagements, that allowed people to display their talent. They were spectacular. They were great to work in, and they changed the industries they were a part of. And one of the things that we concluded was that in situations like that, people have a chance to think about leadership as they do it. So it's not just being in a position and hoping to get to the next position and always saying, it all depends what the guys above us say. It's really being the guys above us. It's our choice. And Warren Bennis, the late student of leadership, said that when he looked at leaders, one of the common traits they had was they had gone through a formative experience, some point in their career, that forced them to think, he called it the cauldron, that forced them to think about what leadership meant. And I think that that's happening at Hire today. So, you know, these micro enterprises are not guaranteed straight shots to success, but most of them fail. So people have a chance to think about what went wrong, what would we do differently, and then they also get a chance to do it again. So in a sense, what's happening is you have a learning engine within Hire that is creating leadership insights. And my understanding is that every weekend Hire, John Raymond meets with groups of people at Hire to talk about these very things. You know, what are you learning? What's going on? What's changing in the world around us?
It sounds fantastic. It sounds quite incredible to be sincere, not just fantastic. I have one last question for you, and we're really at the end of this conversation. Lots of ideas. I would like to project what we are seeing here into the society. I don't know if you acknowledge that, but we feel we're living we are approaching a sort of inflection point, which, let's say, the way in which human beings are inhabiting the planet must shift if we want to survive, at least because we have this planet only. And that probably means that also large organizations, corporations must have a role in it. I'm wondering whether what Hire is doing in decoupling the business in many interconnected micro enterprises, transferring the ownership and accountability to individuals, and then maybe opening this up to the entire society, not just to some external enterprises, could be the opportunity not just to shift the mechanics, but to shift the reason why, to shift really the why the organizations are generating value and what kind of value and how they are generating this value, and maybe value that doesn't mean money. Is it something that you are seeing approaching, or are we still too far from it and we are just dreaming?
I very much share that view of the world. I'm, you know, we're going through the COVID virus period right now, and I think that we're seeing that there's two things thoughts that come to mind about the COVID virus. One is that yesterday in the United States, we learned that the president knew that the COVID virus was dangerous, but he encouraged people to engage in reckless behaviors. You know, that to me is an abdication of leadership responsibility. I think leaders should respect the people who they're leading. They ought to share information with them. They ought to trust them within limits. Remember, hire is not a wild and crazy place. There are limits to what you can do. I think that what you need to do is to be able to build a system that allows people closer to the problems to step in and try to fix them, and then have a series of checks and balances that protects everybody who's involved. But to vest all of the authority in government officials who are far away is guaranteed to make us learn less and be slower in our response. And I think we're moving into, in particularly climate changes, that will just kill us, literally kill us, if we allow slow and inadequate responses. The other thing about the COVID virus that I thought was so interesting is when people finally said, we don't know what we're doing, and now I'm really talking about people close to the hospitals who said we don't have enough ventilators, and I you know, I'm telling you, you're Italian, you know this all too well. We don't have the right assets. That I was amazed at the output of ideas that came from everywhere about building different types of ventilators and creating different types of PPEs and masks and what have you. You know, there's so much talent that never gets asked. And so my sense is that what Hire is doing with Rendon-Khri is, in a sense, in a microcosm, what we should be thinking about in society at large. You know, we ought to be trusting people to get on with it. We ought to be sharing the information, good or bad, and we ought to be helping them when we can. And that's very different. I'm in New York at the moment, and in New York, caught unawares by the COVID virus, the response was a daily sharing of the information, bad as it was, by the mayor, and then inviting people to come forward with suggestions in that. And New York today is really an illustration of what can be accomplished as a result of that. And I think that's very much what Jean-Ray Min is doing with Rendon-Khri.
I very much like this further connection. I think this is a big hope, not just for business, but really for humanity to survive not just COVID, but really, let's say, these complex times in the technical sense of it.
Yes, yes.
We are really at the end of today's conversation. We'll thank you so much for spending time with us. What we are going to do is to keep having these conversations, these EEEO conversations with other thought leaders, other practitioners, because we believe that there is a need to really highlight not just the practices, but yes, the principles, the lessons learned, and the similarities among what is happening in different parts of the world. So thank you so much for being with us, and we are seeing each other again in the Rendon-Khri Masterclass in October. So we invite everybody that is listening to us to be with us in a bit more than 1 month with Bill and with Simone Cicero. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.